I was 19 the summer they made me a footman at the Marenthal court, and I have told this story maybe 4 times in my whole life. Not because I forgot it, because for years they told us not to. But everyone who could punish me for telling it is gone now, so let me tell you what I saw with my own 2 eyes. The day a man who was trained to stand still for 6 hours without blinking did the one thing none of them ever do. He moved. He broke protocol in front of 200 people. He walked off his post during a ceremony that the whole kingdom was watching. And he reached up, slow, careful, like he was disarming something that could kill them all, and he unclasped a diamond necklace from the throat of the Dowager Queen herself. I'm telling you the ending first because that's the part you came for, but the ending means nothing without what came before it. So sit with me a while. Let me take you back to that hall and that morning and that man. His name was Edmund Rook, and he should have died poor and forgotten. Instead, he changed everything. You have to understand the palace first. Most people only ever saw it from the gates. The Marenthal Palace sat on a low green hill above the old city, all pale stone and tall black windows, and from the road it looked like something a child would draw if you told them to draw a castle. Wide, bright, a long gravel drive lined with lime trees. Tourists came in their thousands every summer, pressing their faces to the iron railings, holding their children up so they could see the guards in their high black hats standing like statues in the heat. That was the version of the palace the world believed in. Inside it was different, colder, quieter than you'd think. The corridors went on forever and you learned to walk close to the walls so you wouldn't be in anyone's way. There were rules for everything. Rules for which staircase you used. Rules for where you looked when a royal passed, at the floor always, 3 steps ahead of their feet, never at their face. Rules for how you carried a tray, how you closed a door, how you breathed, it sometimes felt like. And there were 2 kinds of people who ran the place, really. There were the family, who were treated like the sun rose because they asked it to, and there were the guards. People think the guards are just decoration. Pretty men in red and gold standing there for the photographs. That's not what they were, not the real ones. The real ones had served, most of them. Edmund Rook had served. He'd done 11 years in the army before they brought him to the palace, and you could see it in the way he held himself, even off duty. He never quite relaxed. He sat the way other men stood. He stood the way other men froze. I met him in the kitchens my 2nd week. He was eating bread and cold meat at the long staff table, alone, in the corner where the light from the high window fell. I didn't know who he was yet. I just knew he was the only person in the room who didn't seem to be performing for anybody. I sat across from him because the table was full, and it was the only seat. "You're the new one," he said. He didn't look up. "Yes, sir." "Don't call me sir down here." He tore a piece of bread. "Down here we're all the same, it's only up there that matters." He nodded at the ceiling, at the whole weight of the palace above us. "Up there you keep your eyes down and your mouth shut and you'll be fine. You hear me? You see things in this place, we all do. You learn to unsee them." I thought it was just something men like him said, a bit of hard-earned wisdom for the new boy. I didn't know yet that he was warning me, or maybe warning himself. Now I have to tell you about the necklace, because the necklace is the whole heart of it. There had been a queen before my time named Leora, Queen Leora of Marenthal. By every account she had been beloved, not the cold, dutiful kind of love a country gives its royals out of habit, but real love, the kind that fills the streets when someone dies. And she had died, young. A fever that took her in 9 days when her only daughter, Princess Alara, was just 6 years old. I never met Queen Leora, but her face was everywhere if you knew where to look. In the long gallery on the 2nd floor there was a portrait of her, and even the older staff would slow when they passed it. There was something in her painted eyes, a warmth the painter hadn't invented, the old housekeeper told me once. He'd caught what was really there. And in that portrait at her throat was the necklace. A river of diamonds, the housekeeper called it, not gaudy, Not the kind of thing you'd see and think money. The kind you'd see and think wait, history. 3 generations of Marenthal queens had worn it, mother to daughter, and the rule had always been simple and unbreakable. It belonged to the queen. And when that queen died, it passed to her daughter to wear when she came of age. It was Princess Alara's necklace. By blood, by tradition, by her dead mother's own written wish. Everyone knew it. The whole court knew it. But Alara was 6 when Leora died. 6 years old, you can't hand a 6-year-old a fortune in diamonds and a piece of her mother's soul. So it went into the royal vault to wait. And then the king married again. Her name was Constance, Dowager Queen Constance, though she hated that the word dowager came attached to her. It made her sound old, and she was not old. She was a sharp and beautiful woman in the prime of her power. She married King Aldous about 3 years after Leora died, and by the time I came to the palace she had been the queen, the living, breathing, present queen, for the better part of 15 years. I want to be fair to her even now. People become villains in stories like this, and the truth is always more crooked. Constance was not a stupid woman, and she was not, I think, a cruel one in the small, everyday way. She remembered staff names. She sent flowers when one of the maids lost her father. She could be gracious when it cost her nothing. But she wanted things. And what she wanted, she got, and she had a way of making the getting look like generosity. And what she wanted, one of the things, was the necklace. I heard the story in pieces, the way you hear everything in a palace, from half sentences in corridors and the things people stop saying when you walk in. But the shape of it was this. About a year before I arrived, there had been a state visit, a great occasion. Foreign royalty, cameras, the whole machine of it turning, and the king wanted his queen to look like a queen. So he gave Constance the necklace to wear. Just for the evening was how it was put, just the once. But the once became twice, and twice became a habit, and by the time I was carrying trays up those endless stairs, the diamond river that belonged to a dead woman's daughter lived in Constance's own dressing room, in Constance's own jewel case, and she wore it whenever she pleased. To dinners, to portraits, to the opera. And Princess Alara said nothing. Because here is the thing about Alara that you need to feel, not just know. She was 18 that summer, old enough now, by every tradition the necklace was supposed to honor, old enough to wear it. And she was nothing like her stepmother. Where Constance filled a room, Alara seemed to apologize for being in one. She was quiet, not shy exactly. I came to understand later it wasn't shyness. It was a kind of careful stillness, like someone who'd learned very young that the safest thing to do in that house was take up as little space as possible. She'd lost her mother at 6 and grown up in the cold shadow of a woman who was always kinder to the cameras than to her. I served her breakfast a handful of times that summer. She always said thank you. Do you know how rare that was up there? She'd look right at me, breaking the rule, the eyes down rule, but she was allowed to break it. She was a princess. And she'd say thank you quietly, like she meant it, and then go back to her tea and her window. The staff loved her. We loved her the way you love something fragile that's been left out in the cold, from a distance, helplessly. And we all knew about the necklace. Every single one of us. We knew that the thing her dying mother had wanted her to have was sitting around another woman's neck, glittering at parties, and that nobody, not the king, not the courtiers, not the girl herself, was ever going to say a word about it. That's the world Edmund Rook stood guard over. A pretty palace full of swallowed words. I didn't know Rook had any feeling about it at all. Why would he? He was a guard, he stood, he watched, he unsaw. But there was one thing I noticed, late that summer, that I didn't understand until everything else fell into place. There was a small ceremony, the kind they did half a dozen times a year, where the family appeared on the great staircase in the entrance hall for some medal or some visiting dignitary, and the guards lined the steps in their dress uniforms, and the whole thing lasted 20 minutes and meant nothing. I was stationed at the side with a tray of glasses for after. Constance came down the staircase wearing the necklace, and I happened to be looking at Rook. He was 3 steps up, frozen the way they all are, hands at his sides, eyes forward, not a muscle moving. But when she passed him, when that river of diamonds passed within a foot of his face, something happened in his jaw. The smallest thing, a tightening, there and gone in half a second. I told myself I'd imagined it. Guards don't react, that's the whole point of them. But I hadn't imagined it, I know that now. Because Edmund Rook had a secret, and the secret was this. 11 years before, when Queen Leora lay dying of the fever that took her in 9 days, the man assigned to stand guard outside her chamber, the man who stood at that door through every one of those 9 nights, who heard everything, who was the last face that wasn't family she ever spoke to, that man was a young guardsman named Edmund Rook. And on the last night she had asked him in. Nobody knew that. Nobody but Rook. A dying queen near the end, calling in the guard from her door because the room was full of doctors and courtiers, and not one of them would tell her the truth, and she wanted just once to talk to someone who would. I don't know everything they said. He only ever told me a piece of it, years later in a different country, when he was an old man, and the rules couldn't touch either of us anymore. But he told me she made him promise something. She knew she was dying. She knew her daughter would be raised by whoever came after her, and she made the only request she could make of the only honest man in the room. "Watch the girl," she said. "When I'm gone, watch her, and the necklace, it's hers. It was always meant to be hers. Whatever happens, whatever they do, you see that she gets what's hers." And Edmund Rook, 26 years old, holding the cold hand of a queen who would be dead by morning, said, "I will, ma'am." He'd carried that for 11 years. 11 years of standing still while another woman wore the dead queen's diamonds. 11 years of watching a quiet girl grow up in a cold house, saying thank you to footmen because nobody else was kind to her. 11 years of a promise he had no power to keep because what could he do? He was a guard, he stood, he watched, he unsaw. A promise like that doesn't go away, though. It just waits. It waited for the right ceremony. The ceremony came in September. It was meant to be one of the great days of the court year, the formal presentation of Princess Alara at the Hall of Marenthal, the day she was, by tradition, recognized as a grown woman of the royal house and took her full place in the line. There would be foreign guests. There would be press, the proper press, the ones allowed inside. There would be a banquet after and speeches, and the king would stand and present his daughter to the world. It was, in a way, her day. The first day in her whole life that was supposed to be hers. The staff worked for a week getting the hall ready. I remember the flowers. They brought in white roses by the cartload, hundreds of them, and the whole place smelled like a garden after rain. I remember polishing the long mirrors until my arms ached. I remember the morning of, the gray early light coming through the tall windows, and the hall standing empty and perfect and waiting and thinking, today is a good day. Today, finally, something good. I was wrong about how it would happen, but I wasn't wrong that it was coming. The guests began arriving at noon. By 1 the hall was full, 200 people, easily in their best, the air thick with perfume and low, important voices. The guards lined the dais in 2 perfect rows, Edmund Rook among them, third from the steps on the left side, exactly where I could see him from my station by the side wall. At 1:30, the family came in. The king first, Aldous, gray now, heavier than the portraits, with a tired kind of grandness about him. Then the princess. Alara wore pale gold. She looked, for the first time since I'd known her, like she was trying to be seen. Her chin was up. Her hands were steady. And I thought, God help me, I actually thought, look at her. She knows it's her day, she's going to be all right. And then Constance came in behind them. And around the Dowager Queen's throat, catching every light in that bright, crowded hall, throwing little knives of fire across the white roses and the polished mirrors and the upturned faces of 200 guests, was the necklace. Queen Leora's necklace. The dead mother's necklace. Worn on the daughter's day, on the one day in the world that was supposed to belong to the daughter, by the woman who had taken it. I heard it before I understood it. A sound went through the staff along the side wall, not a gasp. We didn't gasp. We knew better, but a kind of stillness inside the stillness. The old housekeeper beside me went rigid. I followed her eyes to the necklace and then to the princess. Alara had seen it too. I watched her chin come down. I watched the brightness go out of her face like a window when the sun moves off it. She didn't cry. She didn't say anything. Of course she didn't. She'd been trained her whole life not to. She just lowered her eyes and folded her hands and became, again, the girl who apologized for taking up space. On the most important day of her life in front of the whole court, her stepmother had worn her dead mother's diamonds. And there was nothing anyone in that hall was going to do about it. The king began to speak. Something about tradition, something about the future of the house. I didn't hear most of it. I was watching the princess stand there with her eyes down and her mother's necklace glittering 10 feet away on the wrong woman, and I felt a kind of helpless fury rise up in me that I had no right to feel and nowhere to put. And then I looked at Edmund Rook. And Edmund Rook was looking at the princess. He wasn't supposed to be. Eyes forward always, that's the rule, the iron rule. You do not turn your head, you do not move your eyes, you are not a man on that dais, you are part of the architecture. But his head had turned. Just slightly, just enough. He was looking at the girl, and I will tell you exactly what was on his face because I have never forgotten it. It was the face of a man hearing a promise come due. The king kept talking. The diamonds kept burning. 200 people kept their polite eyes on their king. And on the left side of the dais, third from the steps, a guard who had stood still for 11 years took one slow breath. I have to slow down here. Because the next 2 minutes were the longest 2 minutes of my life. And if I tell them fast, you won't feel them the way I felt them. Standing against that wall with a tray of glasses I'd forgotten I was holding. The king was still speaking. He had that voice old royals get, low and certain, every word landing like it had been laid down in stone 100 years ago. He was saying something about how the house of Marenthal endured, how each generation took up the weight of the one before, how his daughter, and here he half turned to Alara, with a smile that I think he believed was warm, how his daughter would carry that weight with grace. Grace, he said, grace. And 10 feet from the girl he was praising, her dead mother's diamond sat on another woman's throat and the king didn't see it. Or he saw it and it cost him nothing. I have never decided which is worse. Alara kept her eyes down. She had found a spot on the marble floor and she was holding onto it like it was the only solid thing in the room. And Edmund Rook moved his foot. You don't know what that means unless you've watched these men. Let me make you understand. A palace guard at ceremony does not shift his weight, does not adjust his grip, does not, when a fly lands on his face, blink it away. I'd seen it, that whole summer, men standing like carved stone while the world walked past them. There is a thing they teach, a thing about the breath and the eyes, where a living man makes himself into a fixed point so the eye slides right off him. You stop seeing them. That's the skill, to be there and not be there. So when Rook's front foot slid back, half an inch maybe, the heel coming up off the marble, it was not a small thing. To anyone watching the guards, it was an earthquake. But nobody was watching the guards. That's the other half of the skill. They'd made themselves invisible so completely that a man could begin to walk off a royal dais in the middle of a state ceremony, and not one of the 200 important people in that hall would notice for several seconds. I noticed. The old housekeeper beside me noticed. I heard her breath catch, felt her hand close hard around my arm. And up on the dais, one other guard noticed. The man beside Rook, who I later learned was a sergeant named Hale, and whose eyes went wide and whose mouth opened just slightly, the way your mouth opens when you see something fall that you can't catch in time. Rook took his first full step. He came down off his place in the line and out onto the open marble in front of the dais, into the empty, bright space between the royal family and the crowd, the space where no one was ever supposed to be, and he turned, and he began to walk toward the family. Toward the necklace. The king's voice faltered. It's a small thing in the telling. In the room it was enormous. This man who spoke like carved stone, his sentence simply stopped, mid-word almost, because something his eye couldn't account for had entered the edge of his vision. A figure where no figure should be. He turned his head. And 200 people, hearing their king stop speaking, followed his eyes. I have never in my life felt a silence like the one that came down on that hall. It came all at once, like a held breath, like the second after a glass smashes when nobody's decided yet whether to scream. The low, important murmur cut off. Someone's program slid off their lap and hit the floor, and the paper sound of it was loud as a gunshot. And there was Edmund Rook, in his red and gold, walking slow and straight across the open marble toward the Dowager Queen. His face, I could see it now, full on, as he passed within 15 feet of where I stood frozen against the wall. His face was perfectly, terribly calm. Not blank. Calm. The calm of a man who has finally, after 11 years, arrived at the thing he was always going to do and has stopped being afraid of it. Constance saw him coming. I watched it land on her. First confusion, a guard walking, then something colder because Constance was sharp and she got there fast. Her chin lifted. Her hand, I saw, drifted up toward her own throat, toward the diamonds, an instinct she probably didn't even know she had, protecting them, or hiding them. It doesn't matter. The gesture told the whole story by itself. Her hand knew what her face was still pretending not to. Guard, the king's voice but cracked now, the stone gone out of it. Guard, what are you? Rook did not stop. He did not look at the king. He did not look at the crowd. He walked the last few steps and he came to a halt directly in front of the Dowager Queen, close enough to touch her, close enough that she had to tip her head back to meet his eyes, and the whole hall, the whole world, it felt like, held its breath and waited to see what a madman in a red coat was going to do. And Edmund Rook bowed. A full bow, slow, formal, perfect, the kind of bow you give a queen. Then he straightened, and he spoke, and though his voice was quiet it carried in that dead silent hall to every corner, to the back wall, to me. Your Majesty, he said, forgive me, this was never yours to wear. I want to stop the story right here and tell you what those words did, because the words mattered more than the act. He didn't say give it back. He didn't accuse her of stealing, and she hadn't stolen it, not really. The king had handed it to her. That was the whole sickness of it. Everyone's hands were clean and the wrong was done anyway. He didn't shout. He didn't make it about her. This was never yours to wear. He made it about the necklace, about what it was and whose it was and what it meant. He said it the way you'd state a fact that everyone in the room already knew and had agreed, for years, never to say out loud. And by saying it quietly, calmly, to her face, in front of all of them, he made it impossible for anyone ever to unknow it again. 200 people heard it, the press heard it, the king heard it. And the worst part for Constance, the part I think she never forgave, was that it was true, and everyone there knew it was true, and now everyone there knew that everyone else knew. The silence had been her armor. He'd just taken it off her. Constance found her voice. Of course she did. Women like Constance don't go down without finding their voice. How dare you? Low, shaking, not with fear, with fury. How dare you? Do you know what you are? You are nothing. You are a coat and a hat. You will be in a cell within the hour and I will see you. Yes, Your Majesty, Rook said. That stopped her. That yes, it wasn't defiance. It was agreement. He knew exactly what was coming for him. A cell within the hour and worse after disgrace, the end of everything, 11 years of service burned to nothing. He knew. He'd known before he took the first step. And he'd taken it anyway, and now he stood there agreeing with the woman who was promising to destroy him. Because none of it, not the cell, not the disgrace, not his whole life going up like paper. None of it was as big as the promise. And then Edmund Rook reached up. I think the whole hall flinched. I know I did. A guard raising his hands toward the queen. For half a second the room must have thought he meant to hurt her, and somewhere behind him another guard, Hale, broke from the line and started forward, hand going to his belt. But Rook's hands didn't go to her throat the way you'd grab. They went up slow, open, gentle, the way you'd reach toward something you were afraid of breaking. The way, and I only thought of this years later, the way a man might reach toward a thing he'd seen once, long ago, on a different woman, in a sick room by candlelight. He found the clasp at the back of her neck. Constance had gone rigid. She could have stepped back. She could have struck him, screamed, done 100 things. She did none of them. I genuinely think that some part of her in that one moment knew the necklace had never been hers. Knew this was the bill for 15 years of wearing what she'd taken. And so she stood, frozen, while a guard she'd just promised to throw in a cell worked the clasp of a dead queen's diamonds with 2 fingers, careful as a surgeon, his face 6 inches from her own. It took him a moment. The clasp was old and small, and his hands were a soldier's hands, not a jeweler's. I remember the silence stretched so long during that fumbling that it became unbearable, that I wanted to scream just to break it. Then the clasp gave, and the necklace came away in his hand. The whole river of it, pouring cold and bright across his palm. 200 years of Marenthal queens running through a guardsman's fingers in the middle of a hall full of white roses. Constance's hand flew to her bare throat. She made a sound, not a word, just a sound, the sound of something being taken. And Edmund Rook turned away from her. He turned with the diamonds in his hand, and he walked the few steps to where Princess Alara stood, and the whole hall turned with him like a field of grass in wind. Alara had not moved through any of it. She'd lifted her eyes when the silence fell, she'd had to, and she'd watched the whole thing unfold with an expression I couldn't read. An expression I'd never seen on her before. Not hope. She'd had hope trained out of her years ago. Something more careful than hope. Like a person watching a door open that they'd been told all their life was bricked shut, and not yet daring to believe it was really open, in case the believing made it slam. Rook stopped in front of her, and the calm I'd seen on his face all the way across that marble, it cracked, just slightly, just at the edges when he looked at her. Because he wasn't looking at the princess anymore. I understood that later. He was looking at Leora's daughter. He was seeing in this grown girl's frightened, careful face the woman who'd held his hand 11 years before and asked him to do exactly this. He went down, onto one knee on the hard marble in front of the whole court. And he held the necklace up to her in both hands. "Your Highness," he said, and his voice was not steady now, not quite. "This belonged to your mother, Queen Leora. She wore it the night I had the honor of guarding her door, and she told me," he stopped, started again. "She told me it was always meant to be yours, that whatever happened, whatever anyone did, I was to see that you got what was yours." The hall heard every word. 200 people, and the press, and the king, and the bare-throated dowager queen behind him. "I'm sorry it took me so long," Edmund Rook said. "I didn't know how. Forgive me, ma'am, it's 11 years late, but it's yours." And there it was, the thing the whole court had buried. Dug up and laid bare on the marble floor in front of everyone. Not just the necklace, the truth of it. That a dying queen had asked an ordinary man to protect her child when no one else would, and that he'd carried it in silence for 11 years because he'd had no power to keep it. And that now, today, on her day, he'd thrown his entire life away to keep his word. Nobody breathed. I swear to you, nobody in that hall breathed. And Princess Alara, quiet Alara, who said thank you to footmen, who'd been trained her whole life to take up no space and ask for nothing and apologize for existing. Princess Alara looked down at the kneeling guard and the diamonds in his hands. And her face came apart. Not prettily. Not the way they cry in the portraits. It came apart the way a real face does when something it had given up on arrives anyway, all at once, helpless, the careful training of 18 years just gone in a second. Her hand went up to her mouth, and the tears came fast, the kind you can't stop and don't try to, running down a face that had finally, after all those years, stopped apologizing. She reached out. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely do it, and she didn't take the necklace. She took his hands. She closed both her trembling hands around the guard's rough ones, around the diamonds, and she held them there. And she bent her head, and through the tears she said something quiet, just for him, though I was close enough to catch it, and I've never told anyone what it was until now. She said, "You knew her." 3 words, not thank you, not the necklace. Out of everything she could have said, with her mother's diamonds finally in her hands after 11 years. You knew her. Because that was the thing she'd lost that no necklace could give back. Her mother. And here, kneeling on the marble, was a man who'd stood at her mother's door, who'd heard her mother's voice, who carried a piece of her mother that Elara had never had, a memory, a promise, the warmth of someone who'd loved her enough to spend her last strength making sure her daughter would be looked after. The diamonds were never the gift. The diamonds were just the proof. I knew her, ma'am, Edmund Rook said. She was kind to me. She loved you more than anything in this world. She talked about you on the last night. She wasn't afraid for herself at all, only for you. And Princess Elara, holding a kneeling guard's hands in front of 200 starring people, and not caring at all anymore who saw. Princess Elara wept like the child she'd been when they took her mother away. That's when the king moved. I'd forgotten about the king. I think the whole hall had. He'd been standing there through all of it, this gray, heavy man, his speech abandoned, watching a guard he'd never noticed do the thing he himself should have done 11 years ago and never had the courage or the heart to do. He came forward now, slow, and we all braced because this was the moment. The guard had bowed. The queen had been unclasped. The truth was out. And now the king would speak, and what the king said next would decide everything. Whether Edmund Rook spent that night in a cell or in a grave, whether the necklace stayed in the princess's shaking hands or went back into the dark of the vault, whether this whole impossible moment got buried like everything else in that palace got buried. The king stopped in front of the kneeling guard. He looked down at him. He looked at his daughter crying, holding the man's hands. He looked at the diamonds. And then, slowly, like it cost him something deep in his chest, King Aldous of Marenthal looked back over his shoulder at his bare-throated wife, at Constance. And whatever was on his face when he looked at her, I couldn't see it from where I stood. But I saw what it did to her. The king looked at his wife for a long time. It couldn't have been more than a few seconds. In a room that's silent, it felt like minutes. And I have thought about that look more than almost any other part of this story, because it's the part nobody else ever talks about. They talk about the guard. They talk about the necklace. They forget that before any of it could mean anything, an old man had to decide who he was. Constance was still standing where Rook had left her, one hand at her bare throat, and she was waiting for her husband the way you wait for a verdict. I could see her gathering herself. I could see the words building behind her eyes: throw him out, lock him up. This is an outrage, do something, and I could see her certainty that the king would. 15 years she'd been queen. 15 years she'd asked and been given. Why would today be different? But the king didn't look at her like a man about to defend her. He looked at her like a man seeing something he'd spent 11 years refusing to see. And then he turned away from her. He turned his back on his own wife in front of the whole court, and he looked down at the guard on his knees. "Stand up," he said. Rook didn't move at first. I think he expected the worst, that stand up was the beginning of and be taken away. But the princess let go of his hands gently, and he rose, the diamond still cupped in one palm, and he stood before his king with his back straight and his eyes, for once in his life, not down. Forward, on the king's face, soldier to soldier. "You stood guard at the queen's door," the king said, "when she was ill." "Yes, your majesty, 9 nights." She spoke to you. On the last night, yes. The king was quiet. Something was happening in his face that I'd never seen on a royal face before in all my time there. He was an old man being made to feel an old grief in public with no way to hide from it. "What did she say to you?" he asked. And his voice when he asked it, it wasn't a king's voice anymore. It was just a man's. About me, did she at the end? Did she say anything about me? And I understood all at once the whole sad shape of him. He'd loved her too, Queen Leora. He'd loved her and lost her and married again to fill the hole, and the second marriage had been a marriage of arrangement and ambition. And here, 11 years later, a guard had brought the first wife's voice back into the room. And the king wanted to know if she'd forgiven him for whatever he hadn't been at the end. Rook was quiet a moment. I think he was deciding whether to be kind or to be honest. In the end, I think he found a way to be both. "She said she trusted you to do right by your daughter, sire," he said. "She said you were a good man who'd be given a hard road. And she asked me to help because she knew the road would be hard and she didn't want the girl to walk it alone." It wasn't quite what she'd said. I knew that because he told me the real version years later, and the real version had no comfort for the king in it at all. Leora dying had not been thinking about her husband. She'd been thinking about a 6-year-old and a house full of people who'd put their own wants ahead of that child the moment she was gone. She'd been right, too. That was the bitter part. She'd seen exactly what would happen, and it had happened, every bit of it. But Rook gave the old man the kinder version. And maybe that was its own kind of keeping faith. Keeping the promise to protect the daughter meant protecting her father too, a little, on the day everything else was being torn open. The king's eyes were wet. He didn't bother to hide it. A king, in front of 200 people with wet eyes, and somehow it made him look more like a man and less like a stone. And I think a few people in that hall loved him in that moment more than they had in 15 years. Then he turned to the necklace. "Give it to my daughter," he said, "properly, with the clasp done, the way it was meant to be given." And so it happened, the thing that should have happened 11 years before, the thing tradition had always demanded and fear had always prevented. Edmund Rook turned to Princess Alara, and she turned her back to him, and lifted what was left of the careful composure she'd ever had, and gathered her hair to one side. And the guard who'd just thrown his life away to bring it to her stood behind the daughter of the woman he'd promised, and fastened her mother's diamonds around her throat with 2 careful fingers. When she turned back around, wearing it for the first time, the river of light lying where it had been meant to lie all along, against the throat of Leora's daughter, the hall did something no one had ordered them to do. They applauded. It started somewhere in the back, 1 pair of hands, then more, then all of it. 200 people in their best clothes putting their hands together for a princess and a guard and a dead queen's wish finally honored. And the sound of it rolled up to the high ceiling and shook the white roses. And Alara stood in the middle of it with the diamonds at her throat and the tears still wet on her face. And for the first time since I'd known her, she did not look like she was apologizing for being there. She looked like a queen's daughter. "I haven't told you what happened to Constance. People always want to know. They want her punished in the stories. Real life is stingier with that than stories are." She left the hall. She didn't make a scene, that wasn't her way. And besides, the scene had already been made, and it hadn't been hers. She simply turned, with that ruined dignity that I'll admit took a kind of strength, and walked out through a side door with her bare throat held high, and the crowd parted for her and pretended very hard not to watch her go. She was still the Dowager Queen after that. They don't strip you of that for wearing the wrong necklace. But something had changed and everyone knew it. The silence that had been her armor was gone, and it never came back. She'd been a woman who got what she asked for 15 years, and now there was a thing everyone knew about her, and you can't ask the same way once a room full of people has watched you have something taken off your neck. She and the king were never close again, what little closeness they'd had. She spent more and more time at one of the country houses. Within a few years she was barely at court at all, not exiled, just faded, worn thin the way a thing wears when the light's gone out of it. I won't pretend I was sorry, but I'll tell you the truth, which is that I wasn't glad either in the end. There was no triumph in watching her go. There was just a woman who'd wanted something that wasn't hers and had been allowed to have it for too long by people too weak to say no, and had finally been told no by the only man in the building with nothing to lose. It wasn't a victory. It was just a wrong, taking a long time to come right. And Edmund Rook. Here is where the story surprises the people who hear it, because they brace, at this point, for the sell, for the disgrace, for the part where the system closes over him and grinds him down for breaking its sacred rules, because that's how these stories usually go. The good man does the brave thing, and the world punishes him for it, and we're meant to feel the bitter nobility of it. That's not what happened. The king kept him. Not as a guard. You can't have a guard who walks off his post, even for the best reason in the world. The whole thing only works if they never move, and Rook had shown that he would if the cause was big enough, and you can't unshow that. So they couldn't put him back on the line. Instead, the king made him something new. There wasn't really a title for it. In practice, he became the princess's man, her own. Where she went, he went. Not behind her with the others, beside her. The king gave him a household post and a salary and a small set of rooms, and for the rest of Alara's time in that palace there was always, just at her shoulder, an aging soldier in plain dark clothes who watched the room the way other people watched the weather. He kept the promise the rest of his life. That was the thing. Leora had said watch the girl, and he watched her not for 9 nights, not for 11 years of helpless distance, but for the whole rest of it. He saw her married, eventually, to a man who was kind to her, which was the only thing Rook cared about, and the thing he made very quietly clear he'd be checking on. He saw her have children. He saw her become, in time, the kind of woman who remembered footmen's names and meant it, who sent flowers when the staff lost someone, who'd learned from the cold house she grew up in exactly how she did not want to make anyone else feel. He was an old man by the end. I'd left the palace by then myself. I went into the world, did other things the way you do. But I went back to see him near the end, when word reached me that he was failing. They'd let him keep the little rooms. Alara, she was a grandmother by then, came to see him every day in those last weeks. I was there one afternoon when she came. She sat by his bed and held his hand the way she'd held it that day in the hall, all those years before, and they didn't say much. They didn't need to. That's when he told me the real version of what Leora had said. The unkind version, the true one, with no comfort in it for anyone. I asked him why he'd softened it for the king that day. He thought about it for a long while. He was very weak by then, and the words came slow. Because the necklace wasn't the only thing that needed giving back, he said. He'd lost her too. He just lost her worse. He lost her and then spent 11 years proving she'd been right not to trust him with the girl. He closed his eyes. I had what was hers. I gave the girl the diamonds. I gave the old man the only piece of her I could afford to give away. A kind word she never quite said. A small breath that might have been a laugh. She'd have understood. She was kinder than any of them. That was the whole trouble with her. Kind people leave the biggest holes. He died that winter. The princess, the old grandmother, walked behind his coffin herself, which is not a thing royals do for servants, and the court let her, because by then everyone understood that he had never really been a servant. He'd been the keeper of a promise. There's no rank for that. There should be. I told you at the start that everyone who could punish me for telling this is gone now. That's why I can tell it. But that's not really why I'm telling it. I'm telling it because of the thing I understood, finally, standing in that hall as a boy of 19, with a forgotten tray of glasses in my hands, watching a man walk off his post to keep a word he'd given to a dying woman 11 years before. I'd been taught in that palace that the great ones were the family, the ones the sun rose for, and I'd been taught that men like Rook, men like me, were the coats and the hats, the architecture, the people who saw things and learned to unsee them. I believed it. Most of us did. It's easier to believe when you're the coat. But I watched a queen, at the end of her life, with the whole grand machinery of a kingdom at her bedside, send every one of them away and call in the guard from her door. Because she wanted, just once, to talk to someone who'd tell her the truth and keep his word. And 11 years later it wasn't the king, and it wasn't the court, and it wasn't tradition or law or any of the great heavy things that finally did right by her daughter. It was the coat, it was the hat, it was the one ordinary man who'd been listening at the door. They'll tell you the palace is about the crowns and the diamonds and the bloodlines that go back 1,000 years. Maybe, but I was there. And the truest thing I ever saw in that whole gold building was a man on his knees on the cold marble, holding a dead woman's diamonds up to her crying daughter, saying, "I'm sorry it took me so long." He was 11 years late. He was right on time.